In 34 years, she was just about ready to reach her climax. And of course, as our story will tell you in just a few moments, the Tarpon Story was one which encompassed all of the people. And we hope that tonight, as you look at these events that are again encountered through the comments of many of the people who actually knew the captain, I hope that you will find this a fascinating part of the history of our community. Tarpon and Captain Barrow. That is the story as WSRE presents it tonight.
You're watching WSRE TV, a service of Pensacola Junior College.
Mr. Mater, wake up! I've been below and she's taking on water and I'm not sure the cause. Can you come below?
Aye, Mr. McKnight. Let me pull on my boots. Aye, I feel it. She's not holding into the wind.
And she's got a list. I don't like it, sir.
Have you alerted Captain Barrow?
Not yet. You know how the captain is. Unless we can show something definite, he'll just say...
I know. He'll say God makes the weather and with his help, I make the trip. That's what he'll say, and we'll plunge on.
Those men were officers aboard the steamship Tarpon, a legend in its time, and the date was August 31st, 1937. Tarpon was running east, loaded to the waterline with goods bound for Panama City, Apalachicola, and Carabel. The 56-year-old vessel, owned and skippered by Captain Willis Green Barrow, had left Pensacola 6 hours earlier, not anticipating severe weather, for this was in the days prior to scientific forecasting. Also, Tarpon had no radio communication. Now, with 31 crew members and passengers aboard, she was riding into trouble. What occurred in the next few hours would make Gulf Coast maritime history and would lead to the end of a part of regional economics. This is that story.
Today, at the end of the 20th century, that tale reminds me a bit of the great poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. When that poem was written, the author said that hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year, and in 1998, only a handful of local people recall the drama of August the 31st, 1937, when the Tarpon... But wait, before we return to the storm and that exciting night, suppose we turn back the clock beyond 1937 and see why that ship and her captain were so newsworthy. The year 1900, the beginning of this dramatic, explosive century, saw a Gulf region far different from our own. Pensacola was by then well into its great lumbering era and had this appearance. Hundreds of vessels were arriving and departing annually, carrying cargoes of timber and lumber to Western Europe. In the forests along the coast, a second industry flourished, the capturing of rosin from tall pines and the transforming of the sticky gum into what were called naval stores. Along the northern tier of the Panhandle ran the Pensacola and Atlantic Division of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, moving to its junction with a second line that carried on to the Atlantic at Jacksonville. When the railroad was built in 1882, it either helped found or enlarged several towns and villages: Milton, Holt, Caryville, Defuniak Springs, Bonifay, Chipley. By 1900, many of these were prospering and growing. However, along the Gulf itself, there was a different story. Several small towns had been founded early in the 19th century to serve as ports for the exporting of cotton. These included Apalachicola, Port St. Joe, and Carabel, and then there were Panama City, St. Andrews, and Camp Walton, too. In 1900, none of these had a regular connection to larger cities where wholesale merchants and special services were available. There was no highway along the Gulf. There were only a few rutted trails connecting the Gulf with areas to the north. The railroad had bypassed these villages, and as the new century dawned, there was no regular maritime service either. Receipt of supplies, passenger service, movement of products such as naval stores produced near Panama City, all of these movements were haphazard at best. Mobile and Pensacola had enjoyed significant growth following the war between the states, and especially since the new markets for lumber had emerged in Europe. By 1900, Pensacola had almost 20,000 citizens. Some 65 lumber mills of varying size operated in an area 100 miles wide and 75 miles north to south. Wood's products moved into these two ports for shipment, and their processing required legions of men in the woods and in the mills. Meanwhile, shops of all kinds were required to serve the fleets of mostly Scandinavian vessels which called here. The ports of those times summarized activities with words like this. Today, there are 16 wharves extending into the bay. Many ships are loaded there, but others receive cargo from lighters or barges which move into the ship's sides in the bay. The city has numerous bars, saloons, and gaudy houses, while warehouses now dot the waterfront, operated by the Lewis Bear Company, Kugelman and Son, and the Lurton and Company. These companies ship merchandise to general stores in the small Gulf villages when transport becomes available. Numerous firms serve the ships themselves, providing food, clothing, medicine, sales, steam services, cordage, and more. The waterfront is dotted with deep-sea fishing smacks operated by the Warren Fish Company and E.E. Saunders and Company. Nearby ice plants make shipment of the snapper catches possible. In 1902, A.M. Moses, a large Pensacola Naval Stores collector, handled 40,000 barrels of turpentine and 160,000 barrels of rosin. Overall, this collection was worth over $480,000, and Moses employed more than 3,000 men, directly and indirectly, as collectors in the woods. This was big business, and part of the requirement was to bring the collected material from the villages on the Gulf to Pensacola, from where it would be shipped to paint makers and chemical firms. Two giants of the naval stores industry were J.R. Saunders in Panama City and H.H. Boyer, whose company operated out of Millville near Pensacola. Both men recognized the need to have a shipping service which would be available regularly to carry their raw materials from the village production points to the collection center. They also reasoned that a suitable vessel might carry their materials plus the other freight generated by the region, and some passengers too, for many companies had sales personnel who now needed to travel to the seaside towns. Together, Barrow and Saunders founded the St. Andrews and Gulf Steamship Company. Their formation year was 1903, and at this point, the company with that impressive title did not own a single piece of seagoing equipment, nor did it have a single employee. It was to start the ball rolling on both courts that Boyer and Saunders employed 47-year-old seagoing Willis Green Barrow. Willis Barrow was born in 1856 in Covington, Alabama, the son of a Pensacola Navy Yard worker and Civil War veteran. From early boyhood, Willis loved the sea. He had early experience on a fishing smack. Then, at age 17, he began a career which saw him as a crewman on sidewheelers, paddle-wheelers, and tugs, many of them early steamboats which plied the rivers into Alabama and Georgia to bring cotton to Gulf ports. Then came a term on tugs, guiding sailing vessels in and out of the Blackwater River, where the ships were loading lumber. Barrow received his master's license in 1880, and thereafter served as skipper and pilot on ships moving out of Pensacola or Mobile, sometimes to New Orleans, occasionally to the east. Those vessels had colorful names like Big Sunflower and Hercules. Later, he skippered tugs, which were numerous at that time, caring for the positioning of many sailing vessels that called locally. When the owners of the tug Okaloosa sold that vessel, this freed Willis Barrow to begin work for the new St. Andrews and Gulf Steamship Company. Barrow's first assignment was to locate a vessel for the new company. To do this, he visited several cities and shipyards, and then he found the Tarpon. The Tarpon was originally christened Naugatuck and was one of 8 vessels constructed during 1887 by Pusey and Jones of Philadelphia. She had been commissioned for the Naugatuck Valley Steamship Company to run on their service between Darby, Connecticut and New York City. Naugatuck was iron-hulled, twin-screwed, and was originally 130 feet long at the waterline. She was 26 feet wide and had an 8-foot depth of hold. Her upper works and the accommodations for passengers were of wood, and she was built with a foremast. Later, a second mast was added aft. Coal was the original fuel, but later in the vessel's life, its fuel would be switched to oil. Naugatuck's owners went out of business in 1889. She was then acquired by railroad builder Henry Plant, who was inaugurating a steamship service between small ports on Florida's west coast. In 1891, the vessel was returned to Pusey and Jones Yard and was lengthened to 159 feet 9 inches. Naugatuck's owners went out of business in 1889. She was then acquired by railroad builder Henry Plant, who was inaugurating a steamship service between small ports on Florida's west coast. In 1891, the vessel was returned to Pusey and Jones Yard and was lengthened to 159 feet 9 inches. Plant also ordered the ship's name changed to the Tarpon. When Plant died in 1899, his successors began to sell off pieces of his company. Tarpon was being readied for sale when Captain Barrow found her in Philadelphia. He liked what he saw, and the price was right. One account gave the purchase price at $25,000, but a second declared that the purchasers paid twice that amount. Captain Barrow supervised that remodeling, then engaged a small crew to help him sail Tarpon to Pensacola. Hardly anyone paid notice when the vessel docked here. Now, to gauge Willis Barrow as a mariner and as a family man, listen to the comments of his grandson, Dr. Willis Barrow, a Pensacola dentist.
Well, my grandmother was a Scott lady, and they had 7 boys, no girls. All the boys lived to be grown, which was unusual in those days because there was such infant mortality, as you know. They all lived to be grown, and my grandmother and grandfather lived at 119 West Chase Street. That's about, I guess, a block and a half from Palafox. They lived there as far as long as I can remember, a long way years back.
Tarpon ran most of her routes at night. She would begin each week in Mobile, loading cargo on Sunday. She would run overnight to Pensacola and load there on Monday, after which she would sail east about 7 p.m. for her stops in St. Andrews, Panama City, Apalachicola, and Carabel. At each place, she would offload and, in many cases, reload. Then, when the final stop had been made, Tarpon would retrace her route, arriving back in Mobile on the next Sunday.
He usually walked to his house, unless the weather was inclement, and then, of course, he got a taxi, but he usually walked up Palafox Street and to his home, and then Sunday evening he would walk back down Palafox Street, and usually he would stop in all the little cafeterias. They had a lot of, not cafeterias, but restaurants up and down Palafox Street, and he'd stop in each restaurant on the way down, talk to his old friends, and he'd order a cup of coffee and take a few sips, and then go on to the next restaurant and take a few sips and talk, and he did that all the way down Palafox Street on the way down to the boat.
Another observation comes from Shirley Brown, whose family has been part of local maritime life for over a century. As a boy, Brown knew the Tarpon and Captain Barrow and remembers them this way.
My dad and him was very good friends. They were both deep sea steamship skippers. My dad was a fully unlimited licensed master, shipmaster. So was Captain Barrow. And our offices were almost next door to each other. And that was the beginning, as far as I can remember. I was about 4 years old, but I was with my dad quite a bit when I was just a kid. In the course of her life, Tarpon weathered many storms and became a legend because of her punctuality. One of the storms was the great hurricane of 1926, and the vessel was in Pensacola Bay as the storm began. Again, Shirley Brown remembers. The hurricane struck. It seemed like it was 2 or 3 days getting here. But the Tarpon, along with all the rest of the pretty good-sized ships, and the Tarpon wasn't a little boat. It was a pretty good-sized steam vessel. And as far as I know, very seaworthy. Now, she left with the intentions of going out to sea, which back in the older days, all good seagoing vessels left the port and went to sea and trouble like this. Now, as far as I can remember, Captain Barrow got to almost to the Naval Air Station, and for some reason he decided to anchor just before he got there, which is just east of the Coast Guard station. And his intentions were going up under the island, because hurricanes usually have a south or southeast wind as their worst wind. And while he was anchored there, the center of the hurricane, 26 hurricane, came over, and it started blowing out of the north. And that's what put Captain Barrow in the middle of Santa Rosa Island. And the lake is still there where they dredged him off. He went up in the high tide. See, the wind shifted out of the north and blew him in there while the tide was extra high. See, we had from a 10 to a 12-foot tide at that time. And they had to get a dredge to dredge him off. And the lake is still there that was made by the Tarpon, called Tarpon Lake. Full of fish, I understand.
Another who knew Captain Barrow well was Braden Ball, who in the mid-1930s was publisher of the Panama City Herald newspaper. Said Ball,
Captain Barrow came into Panama City every Wednesday from Mobile, Pensacola, on his way to Apalachicola and Carabel. And he always had a story to tell somebody, bring the news, you know. But especially the best thing he brought was pastries from Fife's Bakery over here. And they had these great big jelly rolls, which you couldn't purchase in Panama City at that time. And everybody was free to go on board, you know, and buy some of the pastries, go down there and talk with Captain Barrow, enter the crew there. So it was interesting to see the old Tarpon come in on Wednesday. You could always hear the old boat landing down at Tarpon Wharf, which was just about a block from the Panama City Hotel. He always came up there for lunch, and everybody liked Captain Barrow because he was so jovial and always had a little story to tell. Quite often, a lot of guests at the hotel would have a charter boat and go over to the Gulf Pavilion, which was inaccessible by road. You had to go by launch. And they would go over there and have parties and swims and things like that. And Captain Barrow was always invited to go along. But he never did go back to Panama City on the launch. He would just have the Tarpon on the way to Apalachicola, would blow the whistle when they past Redfish Point, and he headed out and would climb up the side of the Tarpon on a rope ladder and wave at everybody goodbye.
Still another who worked with Captain Barrow was former Escambia County Commissioner Pinky O'Connor, who for 10 years was bookkeeper and clerk for the Tarpon.
Well, Captain Barrow was a very fine gentleman, and he was accused of saying that God made the weather and he made the trips. He denied to me that he had ever said that. He said, with God's help, he made the trips. And I'm sure that that's right. But he was a very kind and gentlemanly fellow.
Customers and passengers praised the ship's reliability and her onboard service. Tarpon had small cabin space for up to 65 passengers, and her galley provided what many described as excellent food. But if there were accommodations for the men and women who traveled, crew members had to fend for themselves. Year after year, the new service prospered. The tiny villages grew in population, and the Pensacola-based warehouse companies expanded their wares, too. But through the 1920s and into the 30s, Tarpon remained the sole regular transport service along the Gulf. Highway 90, which would make automobile and truck traffic possible later, was not put in service until late 1936. Until then, the seaside towns remained isolated, and the Tarpon was needed. Into those decades, merchandise sometimes became much larger. For example, if someone in Carabel or Panama City purchased an automobile, it would come through a dealer in Mobile or Pensacola, and it would be delivered on the Tarpon. Machinery for the farm or manufacturer followed a similar route. Surprisingly, the steamship company never developed competition. A service did develop between Pensacola and New Orleans, but none went beyond to the east. As years passed, new safety technologies came into being for use at sea. The wireless and then the radio were introduced. Captain Barrow, a man of the old school, scorned both devices. As years passed, new safety technologies came into being for use at sea. The wireless and then the radio were introduced. Captain Barrow, a man of the old school, scorned both devices. When international shipping suffered losses because of unwise overloading, a new marking device called the plimsoll line was introduced to measure how deeply a vessel might safely be loaded. Captain Barrow didn't think much of that either, and the Tarpon was never so measured. And so things were on August 31st, 1937. The Tarpon arrived in Pensacola to load, and the various wholesalers sprang into action. Calvin Todd, then a young man working with his family business, the T.T. Todd Company, was there.
We had a salesman living in Mariana, and he went down through Bluntstown, through Sumatra, all the way down to Caraville. Had to take a ferry at Appalachia. And we got the orders were mailed from Mariana by train.
At 7 p.m., Tarpon's whistle blew, and within minutes she had cast off. She was heavily laden, and that cargo included many cases of spearmint beer. Aboard Tarpon that afternoon were the following personnel. Lloyd Mater of Carabel was the chief engineer. His assistant was William McKnight. L.E. Danford of St. Andrews was first mate. W.H. Russell of Pensacola was the second mate. Also on board were George Wolfe and his son George Jr. This pair served as ship's clerk and assistant clerk. Dozier White was the ship's cook, and his wife Lily was also on board. She was the only woman on board the Tarpon that day. Adley Baker was the Tarpon's oiler. There were others, deckhands and able seamen. All told, 31 persons were present. Tarpon exited Pensacola Harbor and began moving eastward. There was considerable swell, and after a time the wind's force increased. Rain began to fall, and well offshore, Tarpon passed Camp Walton, though now the shore was unseen. The land was shrouded in semi-darkness, and the combination of wind and rain reduced visibility still further. As midnight approached, the wind began to shift. Now the force began to blow out of the southeast and to rise with each quarter hour. Later, one account declared that by this time the wind had risen to gale force and was, quote, pretty bad. Tarpon's cabins were not filled that night, thus crewmen not on duty had sought quarters to catch an hour or two of rest. Those on the midnight to 2 a.m. watch had their hands full. Second mate William McKnight stood for a time with the helmsman, with heavy seas breaking over the bow. Concerned, McKnight went below into the area near the bow to check the ship's condition. Tarpon was taking on water. McKnight now made his way aft to the cabin where Chief Engineer Mater was trying to sleep. The two men discussed the situation, McKnight urging that crewmen not on duty be summoned to try to keep the bilges free of water. Hour after hour they applied the aging equipment, but as daylight approached, the two veteran seamen realized that more drastic action must be taken. Together, they went to the captain's cabin where he stood watching the storm and urged that he change the ship's course to get the bow out of the wind. Barrow agreed, and minutes later, the helmsman succeeded in bringing Tarpon about. Now the pump seemed to be more effective, gaining on the water level below. Encouraged, Barrow now believed that the problem had been overcome and that the ship's course could be restored to bring them into Panama City. This time, the ancient mariner was wrong. As her bow moved straight into the wind, Tarpon was struck head-on by a series of huge waves which crashed down upon her and flooded the decks. Tarpon shuddered, and with each strike, once again water began to flow between the plates. Tarpon began to list. What happened next? Here is the son of Chief Engineer Mater with the story as his father told it.
My father was on the Tarpon. He was the chief engineer, and he was on the ship when it sank. He went up from the engine room. He was down in the engine room, and the water kept getting higher and higher, and he'd go out and report to the captain just how high the water was getting. And finally, the captain decided to abandon ship. So my father went up and was launching one of the lifeboats, and he caught his foot in something. And when the ship sank, he went down with the ship. and all the turbulence and everything, he finally worked himself loose. But he said when he came up, he was bleeding through his nose and his ears, and he worked his way loose. He ran over to a hatch cover, and Mr. Danford, the first mate, was already on the hatch cover, and he attached himself to the hatch cover, and then they saw the captain, and they pulled him up on the hatch cover, and they stayed there all during the storm. And the captain did not drown. He died from exposure because he was 82 years old. He was up in age, and it was a pretty bad storm.
That storm had affected many, including those on shore in Panama City. Braden Ball recalls how news of the Tarpon's failing reached the newspaper.
The next morning, the telephone rang and said that some trouble had happened out at the Y, which was about 15 miles out of town. And checking up on it, someone asked where the Tarpon was, and it immediately assumed that the Tarpon was in that storm and had gone down in that storm. So we rushed some of our reporters out there. Bill Penny from Pensacola was one of our reporters, and George Tapper, who was a state highway patrolman at that time, later a very influential senator from Gulf County, and a big contractor. Anyway, he started out as a highway patrolman, and he and Bill Penny went out in that storm that morning and in a highway patrol car. And when they got back to the office there with the information that it looked like the Tarpon had gone down, there was no paint on those cars at all. There's so much sand that hit them, it's just like in a sandblast. They'd taken all the paint off.
The word of the Tarpon's plight had been brought to shore by seaman Adlai Baker, who had been drifting shoreward on a hatch cover with the tide. As the tide appeared to change, Baker risked his life by swimming ashore. It was he who called the newspaper, thus putting in motion a chain of rescue events. The Coast Guard was summoned, and in addition to surface vessels, the Guard provided aerial reconnaissance. Those efforts continued for more than 2 days. When the search ended, more than half of those aboard had drowned or had died of exposure, as Captain Barrow had. The entire region was struck by this event, and those who were lost were mourned. Again, Dr. Lewis Barrow remembers.
Well, back in those days, people didn't lay the bodies out in the funeral homes as much as it is now. My grandfather was laid out, as they called it, in my grandmother's parlor, and everybody came by to view him in the parlor. He had been in the water for 3 days, so his face was solid black, and they had to put a lot of makeup, white makeup on him to make him look natural.
When the loss of the ship had been confirmed, Pinky O'Connor and others took action to terminate the affairs of the steamship company.
Well, we delivered what merchandise we had on hand to the merchants here in town, and Mr. Clarence Brown, the lawyer, and I went down to Panama City, Apalachicola, and Carabel to see what damage had been done down there and to make any arrangements for settlement with anybody that needed it.
Shippers, too, reacted. Calvin Todd recalls what his firm did.
Well, the only thing we had on the Tarpon that day was 50 cases of quartz grape juice for our own stock. And I called the Tarpon docks. And they hadn't heard a word from her, didn't know where she was.
And so the Tarpon saga came to an end. There was a Coast Guard hearing which was critical of the captain's safety practices and the absence of radio and plimsoll cargo weight measurements. However, there were no lawsuits, and the firms whose cargoes were lost simply accepted those losses or received modest insurance compensation. As fate would have it, work was fully in progress to construct Highway 98, connecting the Gulf communities when the Tarpon went down. Thus, its future would have been in doubt even if she had not been lost. However, in examining the ship's economic importance through more than 30 years, there is no doubt that she played a major role for cities and shippers alike. And Captain Barrow, with good reason, he became a legend in his own time. Did the vessel and its owner profit greatly? Those close to Captain Barrow say no, that he made a living, paid the ship's bills, employed roustabouts and seamen, and that was about all. Today, the Tarpon rests on the Gulf floor approximately 9 miles south of Panama City. There, early in 1997, officials of the state created an underwater archaeological park over the site. Their explorations have shown that on the Gulf Coast sand, the remains of the ship look like this, with cases of spearmint beer still in evidence. The saga of the steamship Tarpon. From 1903 until 1937, she reigned as a queen of the local seas. Today, well, she has taken her place in the area's history that is so rich in such events.